a heart-wrenching tale of love, loss, and the devastating consequences of letting prejudice poison a mother's heart. When Rebecca, a small-town girl raised in a world of rigid expectations, falls for Darren, a black man who challenges everything she was taught to believe, she thinks love can conquer all. But after tragedy strikes and she's left alone with their daughter Alana, Rebecca's internal demons begin to surface. As she struggles with her own prejudices and the weight of her choices, Rebecca makes a decision that will haunt her forever. This powerful story explores how the ghosts of our upbringing can destroy the very things we hold dear, and asks the devastating question, can a mother's love truly be unconditional? But before we dive into this tale, tell us in the comments from where you are watching from today, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this. The pristine white walls of the Henderson household match their pristine reputation in Cedar Grove, a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business. Inside those walls, 16-year-old Rebecca Henderson sat rigid at the dining room table, her mother Martha's voice cutting through the air like a knife. "Back straight, Rebecca. A lady always maintains proper posture," Martha instructed, adjusting her daughter's shoulders. "And remember, the Whitman son will be at church tomorrow. I expect you to make a good impression." Rebecca fought the urge to slouch further. "Yes, Mother." Her father, Richard Henderson, lowered his newspaper just enough to peer over it. The Whitmans are one of the finest families in Cedar Grove. Their bloodline goes back 5 generations in this town. Rebecca pushed her peas around her plate, knowing exactly what her father meant by finest families. The Hendersons had very specific ideas about who was worthy of their social circle, and those ideas were as rigid as the starched collars her father wore to his bank president job. "Did you hear about the new family that moved in on Maple Street?" Martha's voice dropped to a whisper, though they were alone in their house. "They're not like us. I told the neighborhood association we should have stricter regulations about who can buy property here." Rebecca's stomach churned. She'd heard these conversations her entire life. The careful euphemisms, the meaningful glances, the not-so-subtle warnings about those people. Her parents had crafted a careful bubble around her, filled with country club memberships and carefully selected friends from good families. "Rebecca, dear," her mother continued, "I've arranged for you to volunteer at the church youth group this summer. The right kind of activities with the right kind of people will help you maintain our family standards. The right kind of people, the right kind of friends, the right kind of future." Rebecca's whole life had been a carefully orchestrated symphony of rights and wrongs, with her parents as the unrelenting conductors. Years passed, and Rebecca followed the script perfectly. She dated boys her parents approved of, attended the right social functions, and graduated high school with honors. When it came time for college, her parents selected Riverside University, prestigious enough to maintain their social standing, but close enough to keep their influence strong. But college changed everything. It was in her sophomore year, during a rainy autumn afternoon in the university library, when Rebecca's carefully constructed world began to crack. She was struggling with her statistics textbook when a deep, warm voice broke through her frustration. "That problem's tricky, but there's a shortcut." She looked up to find kind brown eyes and a gentle smile. The young man wore a neat button-down shirt and carried himself with quiet confidence. "I'm Darren Williams," he said, pulling out the chair across from her. "I'm a teaching assistant for Professor Morgan's advanced statistics class. Mind if I show you?" Rebecca hesitated for a moment, her parents' voices echoing in her head. But there was something about Darren's presence that felt safe, genuine. "Please," she found herself saying. That first study session turned into coffee, which turned into long walks around campus, which turned into conversations that stretched late into the night. Darren was brilliant, compassionate, and possessed a quiet strength that made Rebecca question everything she'd been taught. "My dad's a civil rights attorney," he told her one evening as they sat on a campus bench, sharing a bag of popcorn. "He taught me that change happens one conversation, one connection at a time." Rebecca found herself opening up about her family, her restricted upbringing, the weight of expectations. "Sometimes I feel like I'm suffocating," she admitted. "Like I'm playing a role in someone else's story." Darren took her hand, his touch gentle but firm. "Then maybe it's time to write your own story." Their relationship developed in secret. Rebecca told her parents she was joining study groups and campus organizations, while really spending time with Darren. They found quiet corners of campus, off-the-beaten-path restaurants, and secluded parks where they could just be themselves. "I love how your mind works," Darren told her one day as they lay on a blanket under a massive oak tree, discussing everything from philosophy to physics. "You're so much more than what your parents want you to be." But the weight of secrecy took its toll. Rebecca jumped at every phone call, worried her parents would somehow discover her betrayal. She lived in two worlds, the perfect daughter at home, and the woman falling deeply in love at school. The discovery was as dramatic as it was inevitable. Rebecca had been feeling ill for weeks, and when the pregnancy test showed positive, her carefully constructed facade crumbled. She sat in her dorm room, staring at the test, when her mother made an unexpected visit. Martha Henderson's scream upon finding the test echoed through the dormitory halls. "What have you done?" she demanded, her face ashen. "Who was the father?" Rebecca stood tall, finding strength she didn't know she possessed. "His name is Darren Williams. He's brilliant, kind, and I love him." The color drained from Martha's face. "Williams? The black teaching assistant?" She spat the words like poison. "This ends now, Rebecca. You will come home immediately, and we will take care of this situation." "There's nothing to take care of, Mother. I'm keeping my baby, and I'm staying with Darren." The ultimatum came swiftly and brutally. Her father's voice boomed through the phone. "You have a choice to make, Rebecca. Your family or this mistake. If you choose him, you are no longer our daughter." That night, Rebecca cried in Darren's arms. "They're really going to cut me off completely," she sobbed. "No family, no inheritance, no support." Darren held her close. "We'll make our own family," he promised. "A better one, built on love instead of fear." They married in a small ceremony at the courthouse, with only Darren's elderly parents present. Rebecca wore a simple white dress, and Darren's smile was brighter than any diamond. But even in that moment of joy, Rebecca felt the phantom pain of her family's absence. The first few months of marriage were a whirlwind of adjustments. They moved into a modest apartment, and Darren took extra teaching assignments to support them. Rebecca finished her degree, though morning sickness made classes challenging. They were happy, but the ghost of her past haunted every celebration, every milestone. When Alana was born, Rebecca's joy was genuine but complicated. The baby was beautiful, with Darren's warm brown skin and curious eyes. But each time Rebecca looked at her daughter, she saw not only the love she shared with Darren, but also everything she had lost. "She's perfect," Darren would say, cradling Alana with such tenderness it made Rebecca's heart ache. But late at night, when Darren was asleep, Rebecca would look at family photos on social media. Her cousins' wedding celebrations, her parents' anniversary parties, all the events she was no longer welcome to attend. The resentment began to take root, a tiny seed in the soil of her heart. Then came the accident. It was a rainy Tuesday evening. Darren was driving home from the university when a drunk driver ran a red light. The police officer's words blurred together. Impact was instant. "Died immediately. We're so sorry." Rebecca stood in the hospital corridor, holding 3-month-old Alana, feeling like the world had tilted on its axis. Everything they had planned, everything they had dreamed of, shattered in an instant. The funeral was small but dignified. Darren's elderly parents, already frail, seemed to age years in those few days. Rebecca stood at the graveside, holding Alana, feeling more alone than she ever had in her life. In the weeks that followed, grief wrapped around Rebecca like a heavy blanket. She went through the motions of caring for Alana, but each day felt like walking through quicksand. Every time her daughter smiled, Rebecca saw Darren's smile. Every time Alana laughed, it was Darren's laugh echoing through their now-empty apartment. One particularly difficult night, as Alana cried inconsolably, Rebecca found herself staring at her phone, her mother's number on the screen. Surely now, in the face of tragedy, they would welcome her back? But she couldn't bring herself to press call, couldn't bear the thought of one more rejection. Instead, she sat on the kitchen floor, holding her crying daughter, and whispered, This isn't the life I was supposed to have. The resentment that had been a tiny seed began to grow, fed by grief and isolation. She looked at Alana and saw not just her daughter, but a reminder of every choice that had led her here. Every bridge burned, every door closed, every dream deferred. Darren's parents tried to help, but they were dealing with their own grief and health issues. His father's Parkinson's was worsening, and his mother could barely manage their own household, let alone help with a baby. The few friends Rebecca had made through Darren gradually drifted away, unsure how to handle her grief. In her darkest moments, Rebecca found herself thinking the unthinkable, that if she had just listened to her parents, if she had just stayed within the boundaries they set, her life would be so different. She would be attending charity galas instead of working overtime to pay bills. She would be planning play dates with other young mothers from her parents' social circle instead of struggling to find affordable childcare. The truth she couldn't admit, even to herself, was that she was beginning to see Alana not as her precious daughter, but as a living reminder of everything she had lost: her family, her social standing, and now Darren. Each time she looked into those innocent brown eyes, she saw the weight of her choices staring back at her. And in the silence of their small apartment, as Alana slept peacefully in her crib, Rebecca felt the walls of her new reality closing in, suffocating her with a different kind of expectation than the ones she had fled. She was no longer the perfect daughter of Cedar Grove, but something far more challenging: a single mother carrying the weight of broken dreams and unavenged grief. The question that haunted her dreams was no longer about what she had lost, but about what she might do next. And in the darkness of those lonely nights, the answers that came to her were as frightening as they were tempting. The alarm blared at 4:30 a.m., and Rebecca's hand shot out to silence it before it could wake Alana. She lay there for a moment, staring at the water stains on the ceiling of their cramped one-bedroom apartment. Another day of endless tasks stretched before her like a desert without an oasis in sight. She dragged herself out of bed and into her waitress uniform, applying makeup to hide the dark circles under her eyes. The morning shift at the diner started at 5:30 a.m., and Mrs. Rodriguez from next door would arrive soon to watch Alana until school started. "Good morning, Mrs. Rodriguez," Rebecca whispered as she opened the door. "Alana's still sleeping. I packed her lunch and laid out her clothes." The elderly woman nodded kindly. "No te preocupes, mi amor. We will be fine." Rebecca's first job of the day was a blur of coffee refills and forced smiles. Her feet ached in the cheap shoes she'd bought at the discount store, but she couldn't afford better ones. Not with Alana growing so fast and needing new clothes every few months. "Order up for table 7, shouted Jerry, the cook, as Rebecca carried the plates to her customers, a well-dressed couple about her age. She couldn't help but notice the woman's designer handbag and perfectly manicured nails. Once she'd been destined for that life. "Excuse me," the woman called her back. "This isn't what I ordered. I specifically said egg whites only." Rebecca apologized and returned to the kitchen, fighting back tears of frustration. By the time her shift ended at 2 p.m., she had just enough time to pick up Alana from school before heading to her evening job at the grocery store. Outside Alana's elementary school, the other mothers gathered in tight circles, whispering as Rebecca approached. She'd grown used to their looks, some pitying, some judgmental, some openly hostile. "Mommy!" Alana's voice rang out across the playground as she ran toward Rebecca, her dark curls bouncing with each step. At 5 years old, she was the spitting image of Darren, from her warm brown skin to her infectious smile. "Hi, sweetie," Rebecca managed, noticing the other mother's stares intensify. "How was school today?" Alana's smile faltered slightly. "Jamie wouldn't play with me at recess. She said her mommy told her not to." Rebecca's jaw tightened. It wasn't the first time this had happened, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. The casual cruelty of children often reflected their parents' prejudices. "Look what I made for you." Alana pulled a slightly crumpled drawing from her backpack. It showed 2 stick figures holding hands, one small and brown, one taller and pink. Hearts floated around them. "That's nice," Rebecca said distantly, already thinking about her next shift. "Put it in your bag. We need to hurry." Alana's face fell, but she carefully tucked the drawing away. Can we get ice cream today? No, Alana. I have to work. But you always have to work, Alana whispered, her lower lip trembling. Rebecca felt the familiar mixture of guilt and resentment rise in her throat. That's because someone has to pay the bills. At the grocery store, Rebecca stocked shelves while Alana sat in the break room, coloring and waiting. Sometimes, when business was slow, she could hear her daughter's voice carrying down the aisles, chatting with anyone who would listen. My mommy works really hard, Alana told Mrs. Peterson, a regular customer. And when she's done, we're going to read stories together. Right, Mommy? Rebecca pretended not to hear, focusing instead on arranging cans of soup in perfect rows. She knew she wouldn't have the energy for stories later. She never did anymore. That night, like most nights, dinner was whatever Rebecca could throw together quickly. Mac and cheese from a box, with hot dogs cut into small pieces. Alana chatted happily about her day, while Rebecca pushed food around her plate, her mind wandering to bills that needed paying and the growing hole in Alana's shoes. Mommy, can I sleep in your bed tonight? Alana asked, her eyes hopeful. I had a bad dream last night. No, Alana. You need to sleep in your own bed. But Daddy used to let me. Daddy's not here anymore. Rebecca snapped, instantly regretting her harsh tone as Alana's eyes filled with tears. Later, after putting Alana to bed, Rebecca sat at their small kitchen table, surrounded by past due notices and collection letters. The walls of their apartment seemed to close in around her, and Darren's absence felt more acute than ever. She could hear Alana's quiet sniffles through the thin walls, and instead of feeling maternal concern, she felt suffocated. Every cry, every need, every reminder of Darren and Alana's features seemed to tighten the noose around her neck. The breaking point came on a Tuesday. It started like any other day, but everything that could go wrong did. Rebecca spilled coffee on her uniform and had to change, making her late for her shift. Her manager, Dr. Pei. At school, Alana had gotten into trouble for pushing a boy who had called her a racial slur, a word that made Rebecca's skin crawl, not just because of its hatred, but because it reminded her of words she'd heard at her parents' dinner table growing up. The school principal, a thin-lipped woman named Mrs. Hawkins, had called Rebecca in for a meeting. While we don't condone the other child's language, Mrs. Hawkins said, her tone suggesting otherwise, violence is never the answer. Perhaps Alana's background makes her more prone to aggressive behavior. Rebecca sat there, fury and shame warring in her chest. She should defend her daughter, should rage against the injustice. Instead, she mumbled an apology and promised it wouldn't happen again. That evening, as rain pounded against the windows and thunder rolled overhead, Rebecca reached her breaking point. Alana had been especially clingy, seeking comfort from the storm, but Rebecca felt nothing but irritation at her daughter's presence. Mommy, I'm scared, Alana whimpered, clutching her stuffed elephant, a gift from Darren before he died. Rebecca stared at her daughter, really stared at her, and felt something inside her snap. In Alana's face, she saw every dream she'd sacrificed, every hardship she'd endured, every judgment she'd faced. And in that moment, a terrible thought crystallized. She couldn't do this anymore. The decision, once made, seemed to take on a life of its own. Rebecca packed a small bag for Alana while the girl slept, including her favorite pajamas and the stuffed elephant. She found the address for the state-run foster home in the next town over. She'd looked it up weeks ago, though she hadn't admitted to herself why. Around midnight, she gently woke Alana. We're going on a little trip, she said, forcing brightness into her voice. Now? Alana asked sleepily, clutching her elephant. Yes, now. Put on your coat. The drive was silent except for the sound of windshield wipers and Alana's occasional questions, which Rebecca deflected. The foster home was a large, institutional-looking building with security lights illuminating its brick facade. Mommy, where are we? Alana asked as Rebecca led her to the front door. This is where you're going to stay for a while, Rebecca said, her voice mechanical. But I want to stay with you. Alana's grip on her hand tightened. Rebecca rang the doorbell, her heart pounding. A tired-looking woman answered, her eyes widening as she took in the scene. I can't take care of her anymore, Rebecca said quickly, before she could change her mind. Her name is Alana. She's 5. She needs someone better than me. "Ma'am, there are procedures," the woman began, but Rebecca was already pulling her hand from Alana's grasp. "Mommy." Alana's voice cracked with fear. "Mommy, please." Rebecca forced herself not to look back as she walked to her car, even as Alana's screams pierced the night air. "Mommy, please don't leave me. I'll be good. I promise I'll be good." The drive home was a blur. Rebecca told herself she'd done the right thing. Alana deserved better, deserved a family who could provide for her properly, who wouldn't resent her for existing, who wouldn't see a ghost every time they looked at her face. But as days passed, the image of Alana's terrified face haunted her. She imagined her daughter waiting by windows, watching for a car that wouldn't come. She pictured the stuffed elephant growing damp with tears as Alana cried herself to sleep each night. The social worker called several times, leaving messages about proper procedures and legal obligations. Rebecca deleted them all. At the foster home, Alana did wait by the window. Day after day, she pressed her small hands against the glass, watching every car that passed, certain that each one would bring her mother back. The other children tried to include her in their games, but Alana remained apart, clutching her elephant and waiting. "Your mom's not coming back," an older girl finally told her, not unkindly. "Mine didn't either. You get used to it." But Alana didn't get used to it. Each night, she whispered to her elephant, telling it stories about her daddy who had gone to heaven and her mommy who would surely come back for her. Until one day, she stopped whispering, stopped waiting, stopped believing. Meanwhile, Rebecca threw herself into erasing all evidence of her life as a mother. She donated Alana's clothes to Goodwill, packed away photos, and took extra shifts at work to keep herself busy. When thoughts of Alana crept in, she pushed them away, focusing instead on the future she could now rebuild. She told herself that somewhere, Alana was being welcomed into a loving family who could give her everything Rebecca couldn't. She imagined her daughter growing up in a stable home, with parents who didn't carry the weight of lost dreams and bitter regrets. But late at night, when the apartment was too quiet and the shadows too long, Rebecca would remember the weight of Alana in her arms, the sound of her laughter, the way her eyes lit up when she smiled, just like Darren's had. In those moments, the truth would threaten to break through her carefully constructed wall of justifications. She hadn't abandoned Alana for her daughter's sake, but for her own. These thoughts were dangerous, so Rebecca did what she'd learned to do best. She buried them deep, locked them away with memories of Darren's smile and her parents' rejection and all the other pieces of herself she couldn't bear to face. She took down the children's drawings from the refrigerator, packed away the tiny shoes by the door, and told herself that this was a new beginning. But even as she repeated this mantra, she knew she was really just continuing what her parents had taught her long ago, running from anything that didn't fit into her idea of what life should be. In the end, Rebecca did what generations of her family had done before her. She chose the easier path, the cleaner break, the socially acceptable facade. She became what her parents had always wanted, alone but uncomplicated, pure but empty, free but haunted. And somewhere across town, a little girl with her father's eyes held tight to a stuffed elephant, learning far too young that sometimes the people who are supposed to love you the most are the ones who hurt you the deepest. The foster care system was a revolving door of temporary homes and forgotten promises. In the 3 years following her mother's abandonment, 8-year-old Alana Williams had lived in 6 different houses, each one blending into the next like watercolors in the rain. There was the Peterson family, who kept their mixed-race foster children as status symbols of their colorblind worldview. Mrs. Peterson would parade Alana around her church group like a prized exhibit, while Mr. Peterson complained about her hair products being too expensive. Then came the Stevensons, who had 4 other foster children and treated them all like unpaid housekeepers. Alana spent 6 months there, learning to scrub floors and wash windows until her small hands cracked and bled. The Martins were next, lasting only 2 months before deciding Alana was too difficult after she dared to ask questions about her cultural identity. "We don't see color in this house," Mrs. Martin had said firmly, while simultaneously forbidding Alana from wearing her natural hair to school. Through it all, Alana kept her stuffed elephant, now worn and gray from years of tears and tight embraces. She'd named him Darwin, after reading about the scientist in a library book. Darwin and I are observers, she would tell herself during particularly hard nights. We're studying human nature. It was a rainy Tuesday when Miss Phillips, her fourth social worker in 3 years, drove her to yet another new home. This one's different, Miss Phillips promised, though Alana had heard those words before. But when the car pulled up to a modest brick house with flowers spilling out of window boxes, something did feel different. Perhaps it was the wind chimes that sang a gentle welcome, or the smell of fresh bread wafting through the screen door. Mrs. Rose Evans stood on the porch, her silver hair gleaming in the afternoon light. She was tall and elegant, with deep brown skin that seemed to glow with inner warmth, and eyes that held both wisdom and mischief. "Well, come on up here, child," Mrs. Evans called out, her voice rich and melodious. No point getting soaked in that rain. Alana climbed the steps slowly, clutching Darwin to her chest. She'd learned to be cautious with new foster parents, to guard her heart against inevitable disappointment. Mrs. Evans knelt down, despite her arthritic knees, to meet Alana at eye level. "I hear you're quite the observer," she said, nodding at Darwin. "That's good. The world needs more people who pay attention." Something in Mrs. Evans' direct gaze, in the way she spoke to Alana like a person rather than a problem to be solved, made Alana's carefully constructed walls tremble. The first few weeks were a dance of careful observation on both sides. Mrs. Evans never pushed, never demanded instant trust or affection. Instead, she created space for Alana to simply be. One morning, as Mrs. Evans braided Alana's hair with skilled, gentle hands, she began to sing softly, an old spiritual that spoke of strength and survival. "You know," she said, working coconut oil into Alana's curls, "this hair of yours is a crown. Every curl tells a story of where you come from, of the strength you carry in your blood." The other foster homes said it was too difficult to manage, Alana admitted quietly. Mrs. Evans clicked her tongue. "Child, they just didn't know how to appreciate its glory. Remember this. Anything worth having takes work, whether it's beautiful hair or a beautiful life." Slowly, under Mrs. Evans' patient care, Alana began to bloom. The elderly woman's house became a sanctuary of learning and self-discovery. The walls were lined with books, everything from African American history to classical literature, and Mrs. Evans encouraged Alana to read them all. "Knowledge," Mrs. Evans would say, "is something nobody can take from you. They can take your possessions, change your circumstances, but what's in your mind belongs to you alone." When Alana came home crying one day because a classmate had called her a racial slur, Mrs. Evans didn't just offer comfort. She offered context and empowerment. "Sit down," she said, pulling out a photo album. "Let me tell you about your people. Not just the pain we've endured, but the glory we've achieved." For hours, she shared stories of civil rights leaders, artists, scientists, and everyday heroes who had faced discrimination but refused to be diminished by it. "Their strength flows in your veins," she told Alana. "Their dreams live in your possibilities." Under Mrs. Evans' guidance, Alana's grades soared. The same observant nature that had helped her survive in foster care made her excel in academics. She developed a particular interest in debate club, where her ability to construct logical arguments and speak with passion caught the attention of her teachers. "You've got a lawyer's mind," Mrs. Evans remarked one evening, watching Alana prepare for a debate competition. "Always looking at all angles, always fighting for what's right." The idea took root in Alana's mind. She began to research law schools, reading about civil rights attorneys and family law advocates. The more she learned, the more she could picture herself in that role, helping other children who, like her, had been lost in the system. But life had taught Alana that happiness was often fleeting. In her junior year of high school, Mrs. Evans began to slow down. The woman who had once seemed indestructible now needed help climbing the stairs, and her vibrant voice grew softer. "Don't you worry about me," Mrs. Evans would say, catching Alana's concerned glances. "I've lived a full life. Now it's time for you to live yours." One autumn morning, as golden leaves danced outside the window, Mrs. Evans called Alana to her bedside. "I need you to promise me something," she said, her voice weak but determined. "Anything," Alana replied, holding her foster mother's hand. "Promise me you'll use your pain as fuel, not poison. Promise me you'll help other children find their way home, not just to a house, but to themselves." "I promise," Alana whispered, tears falling freely. Mrs. Evans passed away peacefully that night, leaving Alana with a legacy of love, wisdom, and purpose. The funeral was attended by dozens of former foster children whose lives Mrs. Evans had touched, each with their own story of how she had helped them find their path. Grief threatened to overwhelm Alana, but she remembered Mrs. Evans' words about using pain as fuel. She channeled her sorrow into her studies, graduating as valedictorian of her high school class. Her graduation speech moved the entire audience to tears as she spoke about resilience, identity, and the power of unconditional love. "One person who believes in you," she said, her voice strong and clear, "can help you learn to believe in yourself." The scholarship offers came pouring in. Alana chose Harvard Law School, the same institution where Thurgood Marshall had studied. The day she received her acceptance letter, she sat by Mrs. Evans' grave, Darwin the elephant still in her arms. "I did it, Mama Rose," she whispered, using the name she'd only called Mrs. Evans in her heart. "And I'm just getting started." Law school was challenging, but Alana had learned from the best about perseverance. She excelled in her classes, particularly in family law and civil rights courses. Her professors noted her unique perspective and passionate advocacy for foster children's rights. During her internship at a family law firm, Alana worked on a case involving a young mixed-race girl being bounced between foster homes. The parallels to her own story were unmistakable, but instead of breaking her, they strengthened her resolve. "Your Honor," she argued in her first court appearance as a student attorney, "every day a child spends without stability and support is a day they learn the wrong lessons about their worth. We have the power to change that narrative." She won the case, securing a permanent placement for the child with a loving family who understood the importance of cultural identity and emotional support. After graduating with honors, Alana had her pick of prestigious law firms. Instead, she chose to join a nonprofit organization specializing in foster care advocacy and family reunification. Her office wall held two precious items: her law degree and a photograph of Mrs. Evans. On her first day as a practicing attorney, Alana wore her natural hair in a crown of curls, just as Mrs. Evans had taught her. She carried Darwin in her briefcase, a reminder of where she'd come from and why she fought so hard for every child who came through her door. Her reputation grew quickly in legal circles. Judges respected her thoroughness and passion, while clients loved her empathetic approach and fierce advocacy. She never forgot what it felt like to be a scared child clutching a stuffed elephant, and that memory informed every case she handled. One afternoon, as she successfully argued for better oversight of foster placements, a senior judge pulled her aside. "Ms. Williams," he said, "you've done more for foster care reform in 2 years than most attorneys do in a lifetime. What drives you?" Alana thought of Mrs. Evans, of Darwin, of all the homes that weren't homes, and of the woman who had taught her to transform her pain into purpose. "I believe," she said carefully, "that every child deserves someone who will fight for them until they learn to fight for themselves." In her spare time, Alana began mentoring foster children, particularly those struggling with identity and belonging. She created a scholarship program in Mrs. Evans' name, specifically for foster children pursuing higher education. Her office became known as a place of hope, where pictures drawn by grateful children covered the walls and a worn stuffed elephant sat proudly on her desk. Each time she won a case, each time she helped a child find stability or reunited a family committed to healing, she felt Mrs. Evans' presence. "Use your pain as fuel, not poison," she would whisper to herself in challenging moments, the words as powerful as they had been when first spoken. Alana had learned that home wasn't always where you started, but it could be where you chose to build it. She had learned that family wasn't always blood, but it was always love. Most importantly, she had learned that sometimes the greatest act of defiance against pain was to use it to help others heal. Alana Williams had become everything Mrs. Evans knew she could be: a warrior for justice, a voice for the voiceless, and a living testament to the power of unconditional love. She had taken her broken pieces and built them into a bridge for others to cross to safety. And somewhere, she knew Mrs. Evans was smiling. Life had a way of coming full circle, Rebecca thought as she watched her daughter Emma play in the sprinkler. At 12, Emma was the same age Rebecca had been when her own parents began shaping her into their perfect ideal of a daughter. Now, 25 years later, Rebecca had everything she'd been groomed to want: a successful husband, a beautiful home in an exclusive neighborhood, and 2 children who fit perfectly into Christmas card photos. James Thompson, her husband of 15 years, was everything her parents would have approved of: wealthy, white, from a good family. They'd met at a charity gala where Rebecca had been volunteering, desperate to rebuild her life after everything. He'd been recently divorced, looking for someone to help raise his young son Michael, and Rebecca had seemed like the perfect candidate. Their courtship had been swift and practical. Within a year, they were married, and Rebecca found herself living in a house 3 times the size of her childhood home. Michael, who'd been 5 at the time, quickly adapted to having a new mother. Emma came along a year later, completing their picture-perfect family portrait. But perfection, Rebecca was learning, came with its own price. "Mom, watch this," Emma called out, executing a perfect cartwheel through the water. Her long blonde hair, so like Rebecca's own, sparkled in the sunlight. Rebecca smiled automatically, but her mind wandered to another child, another summer, another life. Lately, these thoughts have been coming more frequently, uninvited and unwelcome. Mrs. Thompson, Maria, their housekeeper, appeared at her elbow. The school called. Michael forgot his science project again. Rebecca sighed. At 15, Michael was becoming increasingly forgetful, a typical teenager in every way. "I'll drop it off," she said, rising from her comfortable patio chair. As she drove to the high school, the project sitting safely in the passenger seat, Rebecca passed a group of students leaving for lunch. Among them was a young black girl, probably around 15, laughing with her friends. Rebecca's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Would Alana have been like that? Would she have had that same carefree laugh, that same confident stride? Would she have forgotten science projects and rolled her eyes at her mother's reminders? The questions haunted her, appearing at the most mundane moments. When Emma had her first piano recital, Rebecca found herself wondering if Alana would have been musical. When Michael made the basketball team, she couldn't help but think of Darren's natural athleticism. That night, like many nights recently, the dreams came. She was back in that rainy parking lot, but this time Alana wasn't 5 years old. She was a teenager, tall and beautiful like her father, looking at Rebecca with Darren's eyes. "Why didn't you love me enough to stay?" Dream Alana would ask, her voice heavy with sadness. "Was I too much of a reminder? Too dark? Too different?" Rebecca would try to reach for her, to explain, but Alana would always fade away, leaving Rebecca to wake up gasping, her pillow wet with tears. "Honey?" James stirred beside her. "Another nightmare?" "I'm fine," she lied the same way she'd been lying for years. "Go back to sleep." But sleep became increasingly elusive as the dreams grew more frequent. During the day, Rebecca threw herself into volunteering, into organizing charity events, into being the perfect wife and mother. But the cracks were beginning to show. She forgot important appointments. She zoned out during PTA meetings. She found herself staring at old photos hidden in the back of her closet. Photos of a young woman with a black man, both of them smiling. Both of them naive enough to believe love could conquer all. The headache started in spring. At first, Rebecca dismissed them as stress, as lack of sleep, as anything but what they really were. But when she passed out during Emma's soccer game, there was no more denying it. The doctor's office was sterile and cold, much like the news he delivered. "Stage for glioblastoma," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Thompson, but the tumor is quite advanced." "How long?" James asked, his hand gripping hers too tightly. 6 months. Perhaps a year with aggressive treatment. The world shifted on its axis. Rebecca thought of all the times she'd imagined her future, growing old with James, seeing her children graduate, holding grandchildren. Now, that future was dissolving like sugar in rain. But it wasn't thoughts of the future that haunted her most. It was the past. As she lay in bed that night, after James had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep, Rebecca faced the truth she'd been running from for so long. She wouldn't live to see Emma graduate high school. She wouldn't see Michael get married. But she had already missed all those moments with Alana. By choice. By cowardice. The realization broke something loose inside her. The carefully constructed walls she'd built around her guilt came crashing down. And for the first time in years, Rebecca allowed herself to really feel the weight of what she'd done. The confession came out one evening during family dinner, spilling from her lips like water from a broken dam. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice trembling. "Something I should have told you all long ago." James put down his fork, concern etching his features. Michael and Emma stopped their usual dinner table bickering, sensing the gravity in their mother's tone. "Before I met you," Rebecca began, looking at James, "I was married. His name was Darren, and he was—" She took a deep breath. He was black. The silence in the room was deafening. Rebecca forced herself to continue. "We had a daughter, Alana. After Darren died, I couldn't handle it. The grief, the responsibility, the looks people gave us. I convinced myself she'd be better off without me. So one night I took her to a foster home, and I left her there." Emma's fork clattered to her plate. "You abandoned your baby?" The horror in her daughter's voice cut through Rebecca like a knife. "She was 5, she whispered. She had Darren's eyes. Every time I looked at her, I saw everything I'd lost, everything I'd given up. I told myself I was doing it for her, but I was really doing it for myself. How could you?" Michael's voice was thick with disgust. "How could you just leave your child?" James sat silent, his face unreadable. Rebecca waited for judgment, for condemnation, for the rejection she deserved. Instead, he reached across the table and took her hand. "You need to find her," he said simply. Emma, tears streaming down her face, nodded vigorously. "Dad's right, Mom. You have to try to make this right." "But how?" Rebecca asked. "It's been years. She probably hates me. She should hate me. Maybe she does," James said quietly. "But you're running out of time to ask for forgiveness." The next day, James helped Rebecca hire the best private investigator in the city. The PI, a woman named Sarah Martinez, listened to Rebecca's story without judgment. "Actually," Sarah said, after Rebecca finished speaking, "this might be easier than you think. Your daughter's made quite a name for herself." She pulled up a web page on her tablet. There, smiling professionally at the camera, was Alana. She had Darren's warm brown skin and confident pose, but Rebecca could see traces of herself in the shape of her daughter's face, the curve of her smile. Alana Williams, Sarah Reed, Harvard Law graduate, specializing in foster care advocacy and family law. She's won several high-profile cases involving foster children's rights. She's quite remarkable. Rebecca stared at the photo, pride and shame warring in her chest. Her daughter had become everything she deserved to be: successful, strong, an advocate for others who had been abandoned like she had been. And she had done it all without Rebecca's help. "She works at the Children's Rights Legal Center downtown," Sarah continued. "Would you like me to arrange a meeting?" Rebecca's hand trembled as she touched the screen, tracing the outline of her daughter's face. "No," she said softly. "I need to do this myself." That night, Rebecca sat at her vanity, looking at her reflection. The cancer treatments had taken her hair, leaving her with a silk scarf wrapped around her head. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her cheeks had hollowed. She barely recognized herself. How fitting, she thought, that she should appear as changed on the outside as she felt on the inside. The perfectly coiffed country club wife was gone, replaced by something more real, more vulnerable, more true. Emma appeared in the doorway, holding a photo album Rebecca had never seen before. "I found this in Dad's study," she said. "He's been doing his own research about Alana." Inside were printouts of newspaper articles, award ceremonies, speaking engagements, all featuring Alana. James had been tracking their daughter's achievements, creating a record of the life Rebecca had missed. "She helps kids like she used to be," Emma said, pointing to an article about a successful foster care reform case. "She makes sure they don't get lost in the system." Rebecca's vision blurred with tears. "I was so wrong," she whispered. So terribly wrong. Emma hugged her mother tightly. Then tell her that. The next morning, Rebecca stood outside the Children's Rights Legal Center, her heart pounding. Through the glass doors, she could see a busy reception area, people coming and going with purpose. Somewhere in this building was her daughter. No longer the scared 5-year-old clutching a stuffed elephant, but a successful woman who had transformed her pain into purpose. Rebecca touched the silk scarf covering her head, smoothed her dress, and took a deep breath. She had no right to hope for forgiveness, no right to expect anything from the daughter she had abandoned. But she had to try. She owed Alana that much. As she reached for the door handle, Rebecca caught her reflection in the glass. Behind her, she could almost see the ghost of her younger self, walking away from a crying child on a rainy night. But this time, she wasn't walking away. This time, she was walking toward the truth, toward accountability, toward whatever justice Alana chose to dispense. Whether it ended in forgiveness or final rejection, Rebecca would accept it. She had spent 20 years running from this moment. It was time to stop running. The Children's Rights Legal Center buzzed with its usual morning energy. Alana Williams sat at her desk, reviewing case files while Darwin, her ever-present stuffed elephant, watched from his perch beside her computer. Years of love had faded his gray fur to almost white, but his button eyes still held their steady gaze. Ms. Williams, her assistant, Jenny, appeared in the doorway. There's someone here to see you. She doesn't have an appointment, but she's quite insistent. Alana glanced at her packed schedule. Tell them to make an appointment for next week. I'm preparing for court tomorrow. She says. Jenny hesitated. She says she's your mother. The world stopped spinning for a moment. Alana's hand froze over the keyboard, her heart thundering in her chest. Send her in, she heard herself say, though the voice seemed to come from far away. The woman who entered her office bore little resemblance to the mother in Alana's memories. Gone was the young, frustrated waitress with the perpetually tired eyes. In her place stood a frail figure in expensive clothes, her head wrapped in a silk scarf that couldn't quite hide her illness. But the eyes, those were the same eyes that had looked away that rainy night 20 years ago. Alana, Rebecca whispered, her voice trembling. You look so much like your father. Alana remained seated, her hands gripping the arms of her chair. The little girl inside her wanted to run, to hide, to clutch Darwin and never let go. But she wasn't that little girl anymore. Why are you here? The words came out sharp, clinical, her courtroom voice. Rebecca took a hesitant step forward. I'm dying, she said simply. Brain cancer. And I couldn't leave this world without. Without what? Alana stood now, her professional composure cracking. Without easing your conscience? Without making yourself feel better about abandoning your 5-year-old daughter at a foster home in the middle of the night? I know I don't deserve. Do you know what happened to me? Alana's voice rose, years of suppressed pain breaking through. Do you know what it's like to wait by a window for days, weeks, months, believing your mother will come back? Do you know what it's like to be passed from home to home? Always the odd one out, always the one no one quite wanted. Rebecca sank into a chair, tears streaming down her face. I'm so sorry. I was young and scared and stupid. I was 5. Alana slammed her hands on the desk. I was 5 years old, and I'd already lost my father. And then you just left me there. Like I was nothing. Like I was trash you could throw away. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with 2 decades of pain. Rebecca seemed to shrink in her chair, her carefully maintained facade crumbling. After your father died, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. I couldn't handle it. Every time I looked at you, I saw him. I saw everything I'd given up, my family, my future, the life I thought I was supposed to have. I told myself you'd be better off with someone else, someone who could love you properly. That's not an excuse, Alana said, but her voice had lost some of its edge. No, it's not. It's just the truth. I was selfish and weak and racist in ways I didn't even understand then. I let my parents' prejudices poison the love I should have had for my own child. Alana picked up Darwin, running her fingers over his worn fur. Do you know what happened after you left? Rebecca shook her head, tears falling freely now. The first foster home kept me for 3 months before deciding I was too difficult. The second one used their foster kids as free labor. The third one, Alana's voice caught. The third one had a son who liked to hurt things smaller than him. Rebecca covered her mouth, horror etched on her face. But then, Alana continued, her voice softening slightly, I met Mrs. Evans. She was everything you should have been. Strong, loving, proud of who she was and who I was. She taught me that my skin wasn't a curse but a blessing, that my heritage wasn't something to be ashamed of but something to celebrate. She sounds wonderful, Rebecca whispered. She was. And she never once thought about giving up on me, no matter how hard things got. She's the reason I became a lawyer. She's the reason I survived. Rebecca stood shakily, reaching into her purse. She pulled out a stack of papers, newspaper clippings, photographs, articles. I've followed your career, she admitted. Every case you've won, every child you've helped. You're amazing, Alana, and I know I can't take any credit for that. No, Alana agreed. You can't. I don't expect forgiveness, Rebecca said. I don't deserve it. But I needed you to know that not a day has gone by that I haven't regretted what I did. And I'm so proud of the woman you've become. Not despite what I did, but because you were strong enough to overcome it. Alana looked at her mother, really looked at her. Beyond the expensive clothes and the signs of illness, she saw something she'd never seen before. Truth. Raw, unvarnished truth. I have 2 children now, Rebecca continued softly. Emma and Michael. They know about you. They want to meet their sister, if you'd ever consider it. But I understand if... Stop, Alana held up her hand. I need time. This is a lot. Rebecca nodded, reaching into her purse again. She pulled out a bundle of envelopes, tied with a faded ribbon. I wrote these over the years. Letters I was too cowardly to send. When I'm gone, if you want to read them... Alana took the bundle, feeling its weight. The weight of 20 years of unspoken words. How long? She asked, her voice softer than before. The doctors say 6 months. Maybe less. Alana sat back down, still holding Darwin. The stuffed elephant had seen her through every crisis, every triumph, every moment of her life. What would he say now? I can't forgive you today, she said finally. Maybe not tomorrow either. But I don't want to carry this anger anymore. It's too heavy, and life is too short. Rebecca nodded, hope flickering in her tired eyes. I have court tomorrow, Alana continued. But maybe we could have coffee next week. Talk more. I'd like that, Rebecca whispered. They did have coffee, and then lunch the week after that. Slowly, carefully, they began to rebuild something. Not the mother-daughter relationship they should have had, but something new, something honest. Rebecca introduced Alana to James, Emma, and Michael. Emma, especially, seemed desperate to know her half-sister, peppering her with questions about her work and her life. Michael was quieter, but equally interested, particularly in stories about her father. But time, as it always does, moved too quickly. 4 months after their first reunion, Rebecca's condition deteriorated rapidly. She spent her final weeks in hospice, with both her families taking turns at her bedside. On her last day, as sunset painted the hospital room in shades of gold, Rebecca reached for Alana's hand. I know I don't deserve it, she whispered, but thank you for letting me know you again. Rest now, Mom, Alana said, surprising herself with the word she hadn't used in 20 years. Just rest. Rebecca passed peacefully that night, with Alana and Emma holding her hands. In the quiet aftermath, Alana finally opened the bundle of letters. They told a story of regret and love, of sleepless nights and tearful mornings. They spoke of pride in her accomplishments, of shame for past actions, of hope for forgiveness. The last one, dated just weeks before their reunion, simply said, I love you. I always loved you. I just didn't know how to love you right. In the months that followed, Alana channeled her complex emotions into action. With help from James, who honored his wife's memory by supporting her firstborn child, she established the Evans-Williams Foundation for Foster Children. The foundation's mission was twofold: to provide support and advocacy for foster children, particularly those facing racial and cultural challenges, and to work with parents at risk of abandoning their children. offering counseling and resources to help keep families together. On the day of the foundation's opening, Alana stood at the podium, Darwin sitting proudly beside her notes. The audience included her half-siblings, James, dozens of former foster children she'd helped, and a photo of Mrs. Evans smiling down from behind her. "Every child deserves to be loved," she began, her voice strong and clear. "Not just when it's easy, not just when it fits our expectations, but always. And every parent deserves the support and understanding they need to love their children properly." She touched Darwin's worn fur gently. "My story began with abandonment, but it didn't end there. It led me through darkness and into light, through pain and into purpose. And now, it leads me here, to a place where we can help write new stories, better stories for children who need us." In the back of the room, she could almost see them. Mrs. Evans nodding proudly, Darren smiling his brilliant smile, and yes, even Rebecca, finally at peace. They were all part of her story, all threads in the tapestry of who she had become. "The past cannot be changed," she concluded, "but the future is still unwritten. And today, we begin writing it together." As applause filled the room, Alana looked down at Darwin, his button eyes still watching faithfully after all these years. "We made it," she whispered to him. "We're home." What would you do if your past came knocking, filled with pain and regret? Could you find the courage to seek forgiveness or the strength to grant it? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for joining us in this emotional journey of love, resilience, and the power of forgiveness. Alana's story reminds us that even in the face of heartbreak, redemption is possible, and healing can lead to new beginnings. If you like this story, consider subscribing for more stories that touch the heart and inspire the soul. I pour my heart to write these heartfelt narratives, and your support means the world to me. Thanks for watching.